Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you have not been tuned into what has been going on this week, it is Black Maternal Health Week, and we are in day 4. Black Maternal Health Week is one of our favorite campaigns and celebrations. It is a time to acknowledge the disparities while centering Black women's scholarship, experiences, and symptoms of care that honor our humanity and liberation. There will be so many dynamic events, or have been so already, that we have done, and also nationally activities to participate in both virtually and in person. This year's theme is Building for Liberation, centering Black mamas, Black families, and Black systems of care. And it is the core of the work we do here at the Bloom Collective. My name is Desiree Israel. I'm one of the co-founders of the Bloom Collective, a mental health therapist, and a birth justice advocate. This evening, we have a wonderful treat with Toni M Bond, on liberating Black bodies from the tyranny of reproductive oppression. Dr. Toni M. Bond is a womanist scholar and ethicist, completing her PhD in religion, ethics, and society at Claremont School of Theology in California. Her scholarship focuses on the lives of Black women in religion and reproductive justice, womanist theology, and womanist ethics. She is one of the founding mothers of the reproductive justice movement and has worked in the reproductive health rights and justice movements for the past 29 years. We are so excited that you're here, Dr. Bond, and we cannot wait to learn from you.
I am I am delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very important conversation, this very important week of celebrating Black families, Black women, and I'm excited to get into to have some really good back and forth dialogue. I think yes, we find ourselves facing a number of reproductive disparities and disparities around Black maternal health, but I'm excited to have a conversation about what the way forward looks like. So I am just going to jump right in because I prepared a few slides to kind of set the tone, to set the conversation that I'm hoping that we will have afterwards. And so am I good to share my screen right now? Excellent. So I titled this discussion Liberating Black Bodies from the Tyranny of Reproductive Oppression because historically, Black bodies, particularly the bodies of Black women, have been viewed as needing to be controlled and regulated and surveilled. But I want to ground us in a conversation about reproductive justice real quickly. So, what is reproductive justice? Reproductive justice was created in 1994 by myself and 11 other Black women at a conference in Chicago on universal healthcare reform. Reproductive justice is simultaneously a theory, a practice, a strategy, and a public health praxis that's grounded in 4 principles: the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, the right to parent the children that we have with the social and economic supports so that our families don't just survive but thrive, and the right to bodily autonomy and sexual expression. 2 groups have given us working definitions about what reproductive justice is. A group called Forward Together says we believe reproductive justice exists when all people have the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, bodies, sexuality, and families for ourselves and our communities. Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective says reproductive justice is the human right to maintain bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Reproductive justice is used to transform, the theory is used to transform power inequities, to challenge systemic racism, white supremacy, neoliberalism, and to create long-term systemic change. White supremacy and systemic and institutional racism have all contributed to the reproductive and sexual oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we came up with this theory as a way for us to talk expansively about the unique and historical injustices that Black women have experienced around our reproductive and sexual health care. And because we understood that the health disparities that Black women face are directly tied to issues of race, class, gender, economic status, and tied to those issues is this legacy of white supremacy and systemic and institutional racism. So why a strategy of reproductive justice? Well, again, we developed this strategy as a concept to challenge and dismantle white supremacy, systemic racism, and neoliberalism. But why this strategy in particular? Well, through reproductive justice, this means we are able to offer a more stringent critique of white supremacy and neoliberalism than the white feminist movement. And it brings in an intersectional focus. It talks about how the issues are interconnected. It connects the local to the global, and it's based on a human rights framework and grounded in Black feminist thought. And it makes the link between the individual and the community, and it addresses government and corporate responsibility, and it fights all forms of population control, and it commits to individual community leadership development that results in power shifts. And it puts marginalized communities at the center of the analysis and the discourse. And it understands that political power, the participation of those impacted in policy changes, are really necessary to achieve reproductive and sexual justice. And it has its own intersectionality of involving theory, strategy, and practice. And it applies to everyone. So what do we mean when we talk about reproductive oppression? Reproductive oppression is the control and exploitation of individuals, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, through our bodies, our sexuality, our labor, and reproduction. And this regulation becomes a powerful strategic pathway to control entire communities. If you can control the autonomy, particularly the reproductive autonomy of individuals, that is a pathway to controlling entire communities. And it involves systems of oppression that are based, again, on race, ability, class, gender, age, and even immigration status. Black, Indigenous people of color have historically and are now still experiencing what legal scholar Dorothy Roberts describes as a form of reproductive punishment. Reproductive punishment summarizes the way that the state and others refuse to support quality services and resources, but at the same time interfere in people's lives and decisions. Reproductive oppression is implemented, for example, through discriminatory foster care enforcement, criminalizing pregnancy, immigration restrictions, preventing LGBTQ individuals from parenting, and legislative efforts to prevent pregnant persons from being self-determining and exercising their moral authority to decide when and whether to parent a child. And reproductive oppression is a means of selectively controlling the destiny of entire communities through the bodies of women and individuals. And so it's a newer and more subtle form of negative eugenics. So I said earlier that reproductive justice was grounded in the human rights framework and Black feminist theory. It highlights the concept that the oppressions that Black, Indigenous people of color, immigrants, LGBTQ plus communities, and low-income folks experience is not additive, but multiplicative multiplicative. These oppressions combine and create this perfect storm then of injustice and inequity. Black women have developed distinctive ways of interpreting our oppression, and our political and economic status provides us with a distinct set of experiences that offer us a different material reality than what is available to others. Our lived experiences, our relationships, our unpaid work, our paid work, the communities where we live, all mean that we experience a different world than others who are not Black and female. In other words, Black women endure a triple jeopardy owing to our race, our gender, and many times our class. But reproductive justice focuses on the social, political, and economic inequalities that contribute to the infringement of reproductive rights. And it draws attention to the importance of changing the structural inequalities that impact individuals' reproductive health and our ability to control our reproductive lives. And lastly, it emphasizes the intersectionality of our lives and that it is not just one form of oppression, but multiple forms of oppression that operate simultaneously, that impede our ability to have healthy pregnancies and healthy deliveries and to make decisions about our reproductive lives. A little more about the four core principles of reproductive justice. Again, the right to have a child, not have a child, and to parent the child one has, and also bodily autonomy and sexual expression. But I wanted to highlight the right to have a child because here we're talking about reproductive and sexual justice as abolitionist work. RJ activists work not just in reproductive and sexual oppression, but to advocate for the dismantling of systemic racism and white supremacy, Christian nationalism and neoliberalism, and other forms of systemic oppression that impede access to the social economic supports many communities lack so that they can survive, not just survive. So when we're talking about the right to have a child, we're talking about Black women having the being key decision makers about our birth experience, and the right to receive birth support through a midwife and a doula, and access to pre and postnatal care, and even access to the reproductive technology to have a child, because despite the stereotypes of Black women being overly fertile, we know that in fact Black women suffer from infertility. But under the right to have a child, we're talking about motherhood as an act of defiance in the midst of colonization, and reclaiming and decolonizing birthing practices, promoting a more holistic, person-centered approach to care, and dismantling or disrupting the social expectations about motherhood that prioritize middle-class ideals and say that poor people don't have the right to parent. And it's about birth justice and birth equity. And it's about addressing maternal mortality and morbidity, and not saying that race is the reason, but in fact, systemic racism, and acknowledging that we must address the systemic racism if we're able to change the disparities of around Black maternal mortality and morbidity. So again, when we talk about reproductive justice, it addresses power and control of people and communities. A person's ability to control their body is directly related to what is happening in their life and community. So issues around unemployment, domestic and intimate partner violence, access to quality health care, even urban gentrification, all impede a person's ability to directly control their reproductive autonomy. And reproductive justice theory makes the intersectional connections between the human rights framework and Black women and pregnant capable people's reproductive and sexual lives, making it possible to show both the positive and negative rights and duties and obligations of the state, non-state actors, and individuals, because it's not a theory that is based on an individual rights model, but it's based on the collective responsibility of the individual and the community. and it addresses the government's and corporate responsibilities, as well as offers the potential for developing a more expansive moral, political, and legal analysis utilizing the human rights framework. But the US has a history of violence towards Black women and pregnant capable persons. There's this capitalist orientation to Black people's reproduction that we saw through the enslavement and the forced breeding to sustain the US economy. And even through the medical experimentation from J. Marion Sims, who is known as the father of gynecology, but experimented on the bodies of enslaved Black women as he sought to find a cure to obstetrical fistulas. Deidre Cooper Owens, in her book Medical Bondage, rightfully identifies the enslaved Black women who were forced to participate in these experiments as the mothers of gynecology, because they were used often to hold each other down as Sims was conducting these experimental surgeries, and also ended up knowing more about the procedure and the surgery than even the doctors at that time. So they rightfully need to be acknowledged as the mothers of gynecology. And then this breeding for the slave economy, along with that, included ripping children away from their families. And so there was this, in addition to forced breeding, the dismantling of the Black family. And we see it even still with the use of forced and coercive methods of contraception, like long-acting reversible methods of contraception, and not really going through the process of informed consent with people about the use of hormonal-based methods of contraception. And sometimes having providers prioritize the long-acting reversible methods of contraceptives because it's thought that still Black women are not able to comply or won't be compliant with the instructions around, or won't be compliant with using a non-barrier method of contraception, and not connecting preventing unintended pregnancy with also the need to still inform and teach people, educate people about reducing our rate of contracting sexually transmitted infection like HIV and chlamydia and gonorrhea. And even in, yes,
With your slides, did you still want to show those?
are they still sharing? Are they still showing?
No, not like they were.
Okay, let me stop sharing and go back in. Are they showing now? Can
Perfect.
you see that now?
Yep.
Okay. So what are we talking about when we talk about ongoing historical abuse of Black women, and particularly Black pregnant women? We're talking about, it looks like, access to quality health care, but it also is about the inappropriate judicial intervention when a pregnant person has made an informed refusal of a medical treatment designed to benefit the fetus. Pregnant people are often afraid to seek prenatal or open medical care because sometimes they may have a substance abuse disorder or other potentially harmful behavior out of fear of a jail sentence. And so oftentimes they may not want to seek medical care. And we also are still having to deal with the shackling of incarcerated Black women and pregnant capable people, and the criminalization of abortion, and then policies and practices that criminalize individuals during pregnancy and the postpartum period. I'm a doula as well, and I'll never forget my first client. She just finished having the most beautiful delivery. And just as she finished, one of the medical staff, well, a nurse came and said, "Mom, this would be a good time to talk about a method of contraception to prevent future unwanted pregnancies. And would you be interested in hearing about the Depo-Provera shot or another method?" And my client said, "No, I don't really want to talk about that right now." And the nurse went away. And about 20 minutes later, she came back and said, "Mom, do you think you might want to talk about a method of contraception to prevent a future unintended pregnancy?" And here is where the support of midwives and doulas are key and critical, because I stepped in and said, "You're making a lot of assumptions." First, she said she didn't want to discuss it right now. But second of all, you've made an assumption that this pregnancy was unintended, because you asked her if she wanted to talk about a method of contraception to prevent future unintended pregnancies. So you automatically assumed that this pregnancy was unintended and not wanted. The third, the third point that I raised to her was that she had an entire support system in the waiting room, and her husband was in the delivery room participating in the whole labor and delivery process. I said, "So you've made some assumptions that I think I need for you to check yourself and check your own biases around the fact that this is a Black woman who just got through having a baby, and that this pregnancy was unwanted, and that she needs to select needs to be informed, and needs to immediately have a hormonal-based method of contraception to prevent a future unintended pregnancy." One of the key aspects of the reproductive justice analysis is that it provides us an in-depth analysis of white supremacy. As white people become a minority in a nation of minorities, we're seeing anti-choice conservative legislators carry out their plan, which has been in the works for several years, to restrict abortion access in the states as a strategy to overturn Roe v. Wade. And so as we await the decision even from the Supreme Court, it's important to have the conversation that Roe was never meant for Black, Indigenous people of color. White women got Roe. Black, Indigenous people of color got the Hyde Amendment, which prevented them from realizing the right that was afforded through Roe v. Wade. And so at the same time, we have to connect the fight for abortion access and to protect Roe v. Wade, even to the discussion around Black maternal mortality and morbidity. There's rightfully been an increased focus on Black maternal mortality and morbidity, and increased funding has become available from both the government and private sector to address this issue. However, there's still a need to highlight the racism that is inherent in medical care. The Black female body is still viewed as requiring surveillance, control, and regulation. Dr. Donna A. Davis names this as a part of the obstetrical racism that has historically been part and parcel of Black women's reproductive care, especially pre- and postnatal care. And so obstetrical racism is a threat to positive birth outcomes, as Dr. Davis rightfully acknowledges. But reproductive justice addresses the impact of structural racism and white supremacy that preclude Black women and other pregnant-capable people from having healthy pregnancies and delivery outcomes free of complications, and even addresses infertility issues. It challenges the dominant cultural social expectation about motherhood, as I said earlier, that relies on these middle-class ideals of who should reproduce. The right to have a child includes being able to make key birth decisions about birthing experience, and the right to receive support from a doula or a midwife. And the praxis of reproductive justice is advocating for Black, Indigenous people of color to have access to childbirth education and birth planning and prenatal nutrition and pain management prior to and during childbirth. However, the support that Black women and other pregnant capable people need does not end with the birth of a child. Reproductive justice also promotes postpartum support and breastfeeding through lactation support, among other vital supports that pregnant and parenting capable people need. At the heart of Black women's maternal health disparities is this societal and systemic racism, which contributes to the psychological and psychophysiological stress that causes pregnancy-related deaths from hypertension and preeclampsia. Those societal and systemic racial factors cross class lines for Black women. When tennis star Serena Williams discussed her own pregnancy-related complications, the adverse effects of systemic racism resounded loud and clear. Williams delivered her first child through a C-section, but she had a history of pulmonary embolism and sudden blockage of an artery in the lung by a blood clot. And so Williams says that she was literally gasping for air, grasping for breath, and telling the medical personnel that she had a history of this disorder. And they ignored her lived experience and ignored her informing them about this previous disorder. And so it wasn't until her symptoms became so severe that medical personnel finally heeded her calls to treat the pulmonary embolism. But again, it was because of the systemic racism and and the assumption that Black women don't know we don't know our bodies, and also that we are able to endure extreme amounts of pain. But also that infertility is a pressing issue for Black women. While it's not the government's business to force Black women to become pregnant, the right to have a child is an extension of human rights. So the question becomes, to what extent does the government hold any responsibility for making that possible? And the responsibility of the government and other non-governmental actors is to address the systemic racism that causes the disparities around Black maternal mortality and morbidity. And even further, to what extent does the government hold this positive duty to not only have a child, right? Or to support not having a child, but also to make it possible for Black women to have children to whom they have no biological connection. And here's where the access to assisted reproductive technologies comes into play. We need to have greater conversation about the fact that Black women have high rates of infertility, and that we need to have that Black women and other pregnant capable people need access to the assisted reproductive technologies to treat their infertility. And also to acknowledge that many of these attacks on the autonomy of particularly Black women's reproductive autonomy is grounded in a strategy of anti-choice religious conservatism. And to acknowledge that religion is being used as a political weapon and a tool of oppression. When we talk about the fact that many Catholic medical institutions, hospitals, are located in urban communities, and at the same time, those institutions are guided by the directives of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that prevent contraceptive care, that prevent abortion care, that prevent miscarriage management, but at the same time don't inform community members of the directives and the fact that they don't provide this care, that is again an area of systemic racism that needs to be addressed, because you should not, those institutions should not be the primary, oftentimes the primary providers of healthcare in urban communities, and yet still get to deny people about important deny people access to important medical procedures. So here's where I kind of want to end and have a healthy and lengthy conversation about what is the way forward. How do we have this? How do we have this application of the reproductive justice analysis so that we can begin to address the reproductive and sexual health disparities that impact Black women especially. So I want to stop here and open it up for some healthy conversation. And let's see if we have any comments. No comments. But I'd love to invite my host into the conversation about the way forward, and even to talk about some of the work that you all are doing as the way forward.
I can say that thank you for that presentation, Dr. Bond. What I can say is that some of the things that we do at the Bloom Collective is making sure that we have continuity of care if mamas and birthing people are coming to us. So like I said, I'm a mental health therapist. I specialize in perinatal mental health. Amber as well, childbirth education with Stephanie, lactation with all of us, but mainly Tanae. So we have each other, but we also have a network of community people outside of us, midwives, OBs that are safe in the community that we trust, and we refer out to those providers for mamas that may need help. And I'm also a clinical social worker, so any other community resources as well as our own collective network.
Mm-hmm. What are the ways that you all are applying the reproductive justice theory in your work, particularly to address systemic racism around Black maternal health?
Tanae, I'm gonna need you to pop on, girl.
Because I really see that as the way forward. I'm glad to see the expanded research about Black maternal health disparities, and I'm glad to see money being given to nonprofit organizations, both through foundations, and that the government has now, at the federal level, elevated it as an issue. But you can't just throw money at the issue and think you're going to resolve it. You have to resolve the underlying issue of systemic racism, which contributes to the health disparities. You have to talk about people not having access to pre and postnatal care, and you have to talk about the violent conditions that people have to live under. And I'm talking about the violence of systemic racism that Black women endure every day.
Yeah, it's actually one of the things we talk about quite a bit is, the violence that begets the violence. So particularly in a place like Baltimore, we always hear about the heavy person-to-person violence. But we'll say to folks, but it is violent that people do not have housing. It's violent that folks do not have food. It's violent that children do not have books, AC, and heat when they need it at school. And so essentially, if you want to talk about, changing it's like really looking at the conditions, what has created the outcomes. And so very much the reproductive justice framing. So even yesterday I was on the radio and the question was asked around children. And it was like, well, if we center Black mamas, the shift what's happening with children would change. And so, yeah, if we don't want infant mortality and morbidity, we have to really change the conditions. And so one of the things I also really appreciate is that we also very much use the abolitionist framework, which is really hard for a lot of folks to understand. And really how I center it is I appreciate Dr. Ashon Crawley when he calls it the otherwise possibilities. So not as like a destination, but the everyday practice of doing something new to build the world anew. And so very much so that's really the work that we attempt to do, which is like, how do we do that internal work to ensure that we're good, to be able to lean on each other, to be able to support each other, and then how does that then also manifest into community? And so
Right.
Bloom is also very much, we are a for-profit business with a social impact arm. And so we also kind of tread ensuring that we never turn anyone away for, the care that they need and deserve.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really trying to think through, like, how do we deeply and intentionally really do this work
Right.
that really brings together the otherwise possibilities.
Well, and even when you hear the discourse about the reasons why uh, Black maternal, why about the disparities around Black maternal health, and you hear, Black pregnant women are at greater risk of having maternal complications because of obesity and hypertension and diabetes. We still aren't, it seems, getting to the crux of even those conversations, right? That the stress that Black women experience is directly tied to the racism that they experience every day, and and the issues around obesity and hypertension and diabetes are directly related to the ability to have healthy foods, right? And to have access to those healthy foods, and that's tied to economics, because oftentimes people can't afford to go to what I call whole paycheck. And I love me some Whole Foods, but but it's expensive to eat healthy. It can be expensive to eat healthy. And so again, it oftentimes feels like the blame is still being shifted upon Black women for these disparities, saying, Black women are at greater risk um, of experiencing maternal complications because of obesity and hypertension and diabetes. We still have to have this expanded conversation about the why. Why is it that Black women have high rates of hypertension and live under such stressful conditions? And so we have to address the conditions so we can address the disparities. There's a question for hi, Dr. Davis. She says, what do you see as the future for reproductive justice? I have begun to talk a lot about reproductive justice is not just reproductive justice, but reproductive and sexual justice, because I think we need to really intentionally connect the two. We do it in the discussion of the theory, but I think as we talk about the movement, we need to talk about that this is a movement about dismantling the reproductive and sexual oppression so that we can achieve reproductive and sexual justice. But I think the future of the reproductive and sexual justice movement is to begin to further expand with other social justice movements whose work intersects with our work. I think that particularly now, as we are now in this battle around voting rights, we know that Black women saved the country during the last presidential election, and so now we need to have a conversation about what that means. There's this attempt to remove Black women from the democratic process through gerrymandering and redistricting to limit our ability to be able to vote and to have our voices heard. So I'm seeing that as a part of the future for the reproductive and sexual justice movement. I know that we are sitting with this possibility of Roe v. Wade being overturned, but as I said earlier, Roe held very little meaning for Black women. In fact, women of color were thrown under the bus to achieve Roe, and that was through the Hyde Amendment. And when we began to allow those kinds of restrictions, like the Hyde Amendment, which prevents the use of federal funds for abortion care with certain exceptions. When we allowed that, we basically allowed Black, Indigenous, people of color communities to be the trade-off so that Roe as a right could be achieved. But when we talk about rights, we have to talk about people's inability to exercise those rights. So then they're no longer a right. So I think that reproductive justice is beginning, it will necessarily have to expand its intersectional analysis to begin to look at these issues. I mean, even the issue of the student loan debt crisis. That for me is a reproductive justice issue, because as we talk about people being able to access reproductive and sexual health care, if they're faced with having to pay student loan debts or monthly student loan payments that often are the cost of a mortgage, then people are not able to pay for abortion services or infertility treatments. And so even that becomes a reproductive justice issue that we need to expand and provide an analysis. Given the different organizing constituencies, what is the most expedient way to address reproductive justice? Well, that has always been the challenge, I think, with both the reproductive, not the reproductive justice theory, but how do you advance that theory? How does it play out in real time, in day-to-day life? Reproductive justice is an expedient. But in terms of organizing different constituencies, a good part of the work is doing the education cross issue education to show the intersectionality of the issues. And I think in terms of the differences around organizing the constituencies, I think it means that reproductive justice advocates will have to work even harder so that you can show the connections to people. My work is at the intersection of religion and reproductive justice, which is no easy task. My focus has been working with the Black church, and the Black church has had a history of grappling with issues of reproductive and sexual health, and an unfortunate history of shaming and blaming Black women for our reproductive and sexual health choices and decisions. And so, as an example, part of my work is to educate the Black church about the role and the responsibility that it has, particularly progressive Black churches, the responsibility and history that it has of being an institution that fights for the liberation of Black people. And so if we're talking about the liberation of Black people, we have to include in that bodily autonomy, and that the fight as a part of that liberation includes liberating Black bodies from the tyranny of reproductive and sexual oppression. What ways do global issues like the war against Ukraine impact Black women? Well, I think certainly as we talk about the market and inflation, and for instance, we look at the gas crisis and the fact that people, as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, that people have to pay $5 and $6 for gas, $5 and $6 a gallon for gas, and the cost is starting to come down some. But we're seeing, as a part of this war, this global impact of, particularly here in the U.S., of inflation. They haven't called it inflation, but that's what it is, because everything costs more. And so if everything costs more and people are still getting the same amount of wages, then it means people are being impacted in terms of their ability to provide food. We're seeing, still the cost of the housing market. And this is, I think not just the impact of the global issue of the war against Ukraine, but we have to bring in COVID and that impact. And we're still reeling. Um, the world is still reeling around the impact of COVID. And here in the US, I mean, it wasn't long ago that we saw lines of people at the food bank trying to get food. And during that period, people having lost their jobs and many people not being able to get unemployment. And so we are now, what, 2 years uh, now in 2022. And while some may think that the pandemic is over, we're still in a pandemic. We are now in an economic pandemic because a lot of people fell into debt during that COVID crisis. And we're still in the COVID crisis, right? So I think, a lot of these global issues impact Black women, which is why it's so key and critical for us to connect, for instance, the issue of voting rights with reproductive justice and acknowledging the fact that Black women, again, saved this country during the last presidential election. And so now it really becomes, what is the debt that is owed to Black women? Because there's a huge debt, I think, that's owed to Black women because we came out in droves to vote and participated in the democratic process because we understood that democracy was under attack. Can I reflect on how movement building has shifted since the birth of the reproductive justice movement? What do I see as opportunities and challenges for the younger generation? Well, I think since the birth of the reproductive justice movement, certainly the analysis has expanded. When we first started our analysis, the three pillars were the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent the children that one has with the social and economic supports people need so that families don't just survive but thrive. And then we came back and we added that fourth pillar because we realized we also needed to be talking about people's right to bodily autonomy and right to sexual expression. And and also talking about the right that people have we needed to acknowledge humans as sexual beings who experience sexual feelings and acknowledge the eroticism that permeates human bodies, and to support individuals, particularly Black women, to willingly seize our human right to be mentally, physically, and spiritually fulfilled through the pleasures of sex and intimacy. And then lastly, to underscore that Black women have the right to gender and non-gender expression and to express our sexual orientation. So the theory itself has expanded, and but also as a part of that expansion, even bringing in a Black Lives Matter analysis and acknowledging that the deaths of Black people are a reproductive justice issue as well, because those individuals had families, they had mothers, they had siblings, they had fathers, and talking about that as a form of reproductive loss and acknowledging that parents and families have lost someone, and talking about the need to fight for Black people to be able to live free from violence in our communities and also from state-based violence. So those are the ways that the movement has shifted since we came together. In terms of opportunities and challenges for younger generations, I mean, there's always been, both on the positive side, I think a healthy intergenerational exchange within the reproductive justice movement. However, I do see there are tensions because as younger activists are defining their leadership and their place within the movement, there is oftentimes this struggle between the more senior leadership and the younger activists. And we have to address that tension. Likewise, even in the reproductive and sexual justice movement, we need to bring in a focus about reproductive well-being on a continuum. The area that we don't talk about as much is about what happens after you're no longer able to reproduce. We don't talk enough about being menopausal and postmenopausal and what it means to have a healthy sex life after um, after you're no longer fertile. And we need to talk about those unique experiences that come along with menopause and your body changes, and what does it mean to live with hot flashes and night sweats. We don't talk about that enough, and so I think that that is an opportunity to have some intergenerational sharing. And I also think it's an opportunity to further expand the work in the movement. And we also need to have further conversation about fertility and infertility. And we need to have that dreaded conversation about surrogacy and who gets to be a surrogate. And that and can surrogacy be an option for Black women who are experiencing infertility? So those are all tough conversations that I think we need to have. That I think could be make for a very interesting exchange with younger generations. The last piece of the conversation that I would bring in, we need to have a conversation about the discussion around whether or not we use the term woman. And that has been another tension that we shy away from, but oftentimes have RJ activists get called out sometimes if we use the term woman and don't say woman and pregnant capable people, or just say woman. And so we need to have that conversation, because some of the pushback has even included saying we need to not use the term woman. And I push back on that. And the reason I push back on that is because when you ask me as a Black woman to not use the term woman, in many respects, you're asking me to invisibilize myself and to invisibilize or not acknowledge the historical reproductive and sexual oppression that Black women have experienced because of our race and our gender. So I feel like we need to have that another tough conversation. What advice do I have for Black-led communities-based organizations supporting Black mamas, or birthing folks in Black families in this current moment? I think that the work definitely needs to include, as we were discussing earlier, when I was talking with Tanaya and I were having the conversation, but getting to the why, having this expanded conversation about systemic racism and obstetric racism, and getting to the why of why is it that Black women are at greater risk of experiencing maternal complications, and having a much broader conversation about where systemic racism intersects with the reasons why Black women have higher rates of obesity and hypertension and diabetes and other disorders that contribute to maternal complications. We need to have, I think, bringing in more conversations about food insecurity and systemic racism as a stress factor that contributes to maternal complications. I mean, the kind of stress that what it means to be this embodied being that has Black skin, that suffers racism because of the bodies that we walk in because of the color of our skin. I think that needs to be a focus, because my concern, as I said earlier, is that still there's this assumption, not amongst RJ activists and not amongst birth justice activists, but still in the public sphere, that the reasons why Black women have higher rates of maternal mortality and morbidity is because of race, and not having that expanded conversation about systemic racism and white supremacy. What advice? Ah, what advice do I have for? Oh, I think I answered that question. I can't hear you, Tania. You're on mute.
Oh, thank you. I said we don't have any questions, any more questions in the chat. It was nice that we had got a few questions from Dr. Donna in there.
I wish Dr. Donna and I could have been in a conversation, right?
Yeah, right. She's on the train headed back up.
Yeah, I know. I
So she
know.
texted her questions as she was listening in.
Well, I hope this has um, been helpful in terms of thinking about what's the way forward. Um, I'd love to hear your insights about how you think the folks in the general public are thinking about Black maternal health. It seems like there's always, when issues come up, to throw money at issues, but not really get to the root cause of why we have um, why we have these issues and why we have these disparities. That's why I was so glad when Serena Williams came out and talked about her birthing experience, and talked about the fact that the medical professionals, the providers, were not listening to her, and she didn't take it, you know, she didn't expound upon the conversation and say it, the speak to the reasons why and the systemic racism, but we know that the reason that they didn't listen to her was because she was a Black woman. And so we see that systemic racism crosses class as well.
Yeah, wholeheartedly. Yeah, but even thinking around the money piece, I think that that is really something that we all do have to contend with. Because you're right. I mean, we've seen that with so many other movements where money is being thrown, but have the conditions or even the infrastructure been created to be able to support them. Like if you've never had money before and you don't necessarily even have like a vision of what you want to do with it, what does it mean? But I think it has almost been, we need the money to be able
Right.
to do our work, but there is something around money just being thrown without any real intentionality. And so really what
Absolutely. And we
yeah.
saw it right after during the COVID pandemic.
Mhm.
And we saw money being thrown, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We saw money being thrown to diversity, equity, and inclusion and Black Lives Matter movements, but we still have not gotten to the root cause
Right.
of why those murders even happened. And
Mhm.
the root cause is systemic racism and white supremacy. So until we address that, it doesn't really matter how much money we throw, right, at the issue if we're not getting to the root cause.
Yeah. And one of the things that we saw even in Maryland around the legislative session, where people who might have relationships with certain entities or who were sponsors for particular things
Sure.
actually were against certain bills that would have been of great benefit to Black mamas and Black women and birthing folks. And
Mhm.
so it's like, yeah, you have a relationship with this national Black led entity, but yet at the same token, you're operating completely indirect to the work that really needs to be done. So it's also, what are those mechanisms for accountability? And on a local level, it's important to honor the folks who are here. Like I would never think to go to Ohio without calling someone like Jessica Roach and getting like the low, and I wouldn't feel comfortable because that's her terror. Not, like there's so many people, but I would want to get the landscape and like no, talk to the folks who are already there. And I don't know if we are also doing a really good job of ensuring that we're honoring some of the folks on the ground who are doing work, or even just doing a check-in, like, hey, this organization asked me to do such and such. Um, what is kind of like, what's going on with them? Are they truly around equity? And so sometimes they just invite you to speak, and everything that they do is completely against, reproductive justice, and so on and so forth.
Right, right, right. No, I think you're absolutely right. And that has to be a part of the way forward, too.
Mm-hmm.
There
Mm-hmm.
has to be as I often say, an ethic in the way that we do reproductive justice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Toni. It was definitely a pleasure to sit at your feet, to hear from you, to learn from you.
Pleasure to um to 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 be a part of the collaborative work that to collaborate with you on this discussion. So thank you so much for inviting me.